Immersion cooling, the dunk tank revolution. Changing data centers, AI, and Bitcoin mining. What if I told you the future of supercomputing might look like dunking computers into a bath? Before you comment, "That's how you fry a motherboard," here's the twist. The liquid is specially made so it does not conduct electricity. And thanks to AI, Bitcoin mining, and hotter chips, this once niche idea is exploding right now. Today, I'll explain immersion cooling in plain English. What it is, how it works, what liquids are used, and why it matters. Why it can save energy and water, shrink data centers, and reduce noise. And who's actually using it today? Cooling used to be a background detail. Now it's becoming a limiting factor for growth. The world is building a lot more compute, especially for AI. The International Energy Agency estimates data centers used about 415 terawatt-hours of electricity in 2024. They project that could more than double to around 945 terawatt-hours by 2030. In some data centers, cooling can be a surprisingly big slice of the power bill. The IEA notes cooling can be around 7% in very efficient hyperscale sites, but over 30% in less efficient enterprise sites. So if you can cool smarter, you don't just make computers happier. You reduce the grid capacity needed to power them. Immersion cooling is simple to describe. You submerge servers in a non-conductive liquid. Then you move the heat out using a heat exchanger. Instead of blasting everything with cold air and thousands of fans. If air cooling is like standing in front of a desk fan, immersion cooling is like jumping into a pool. Not because water is magic, because liquid is simply better at carrying heat than air. Immersion cooling sounds futuristic, but it's been around for decades. One famous early example is the Cray 2 supercomputer in the mid-1980s. It used a non-conductive liquid for cooling. So why wasn't everyone doing it already? For a long time, air cooling was good enough, cheaper, and easier to service. But chips got hotter, AI racks got denser, and good enough isn't good enough anymore. There are two main versions of immersion cooling. Single-phase immersion, where the liquid stays liquid the whole time. And two-phase immersion, where the liquid boils and condenses in a controlled loop. Single-phase is the simpler one. The servers sit in the bath and the liquid absorbs heat. Then the warm liquid moves through a heat exchanger. Heat moves into a separate water loop, and the immersion liquid returns cooled. Think of it like a car radiator, but for a tank of servers. Two-phase looks like science fiction. Liquid is designed to boil at a controlled temperature. When hot components heat the liquid, it boils right at the surface and becomes vapor. The vapor rises, hits a condenser coil, turns back into liquid, and drips back down. It looks like the server is gently boiling, which is both terrifying and extremely cool. The key word is dielectric. That means the liquid does not conduct electricity the way water does. Immersion cooling fluids usually fall into a few families. Hydrocarbon-based fluids, meaning mineral oils or synthetic oils, common in single-phase setups. Ester-based fluids, also used in some dielectric cooling systems. And fluorinated fluids, which were used in many two-phase designs historically. But fluorinated fluids come with a major real-world issue. PFAS, forever chemical concerns, and tightening regulation. For example, 3M announced it will exit PFAS manufacturing by the end of 2025, including fluorinated fluids. That matters because it pushes the industry toward alternative chemistries and changes long-term supply planning. So the future of immersion isn't just tanks and pumps. It's also a chemistry and supply chain story. So why are companies bothering with all this? First, immersion cooling can reduce wasted energy used for cooling. It can reduce server fans, massive room air conditioners, and the need to move huge amounts of air. Reuters reported an AI cloud provider using immersion cooling that claimed up to 50% lower energy use compared to traditional air cooling in their deployment. An Intel case study on single-phase immersion says data centers may be able to cut electricity use by up to 48% in that context. Those are up to numbers, and results vary by design, climate, workload, and baseline. But they show why the industry is paying attention. Second, immersion cooling can reduce water use in the right setups. Cooling isn't only about electricity, it's often about water too. Berkeley Lab estimates US data centers consumed 66 billion litres of direct water in 2023. That's roughly 26,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Immersion is often paired with closed-loop heat rejection, like dry coolers. That can dramatically reduce on-site water use compared to evaporative approaches. Third, immersion can shrink the footprint and increase density. Air-cooled data halls spend a lot of space on airflow infrastructure. Aisles, plenum space, air handlers, and clearance. Immersion can replace a chunk of that with compact tanks. An Intel case study claims deployments can require up to 80% less floor space in certain scenarios. Again, that's up to, and it depends on design. But the trend is real. Less air infrastructure, more compute per square meter. Fourth, immersion cooling can reduce noise dramatically. If you've ever heard a large crypto mine, it's like an industrial hurricane. Immersion can remove many of those screaming fans because heat is not being pushed into air the same way. Marathon Digital has publicly discussed shifting operations toward immersion containers at its Granbury site. Fifth, immersion can make heat reuse more realistic. A data center turns electricity into compute and then into heat. Immersion can make it easier to capture that heat as usable warm water. An Intel case study describes heat being available for reuse as 55 degrees Celsius hot water in that setup. So instead of dumping heat into the sky, you can sometimes route it into buildings or industrial processes, depending on local demand and economics. Now here's a side effect nobody talks about enough. Immersion cooling will speed up the hardware upgrade cycle in a lot of places. Because once cooling stops being the bottleneck, the pressure shifts to how fast can we deploy more compute. It can mean ripping out older air-cooled racks earlier than planned. And that creates a wave of electronic waste. The global e-waste monitor says the world generated about 62 million tons of e-waste in 2022. And only about 22.3% was documented as formally collected and recycled. So if immersion helps trigger a new wave of upgrades, the e-waste problem can grow with it. But here's the interesting part. E-waste is not just trash. It's a mine above ground. Old servers are loaded with steel, aluminum, copper, gold, and critical materials. The same global e-waste monitor notes that only about 1% of rare earth demand is met by e-waste recycling today, which means we're throwing away materials we're about to claim we can't get enough of. Immersion cooling can actually make reuse easier in some cases, because hardware that dies early in dusty, hot, high fan environments can sometimes survive longer in cleaner, more stable thermal conditions. And when gear is retired, there's a real opportunity to refurbish it, reuse it for lower intensity workloads, or strip it down and recover the materials properly. So the immersion revolution has a responsibility attached to it. If we build the future on higher density compute, we should build the recycling and refurbishment pipeline at the same time. Because otherwise, we're just swapping one supply problem for another. So why the sudden explosion in immersion cooling? One reason is rack power density. As hardware gets denser, air cooling becomes harder and more expensive. Uptime Institute surveyed data center professionals. Most respondents estimated that once racks go above about 20 kilowatts per rack, direct liquid cooling becomes necessary. Another reason is scale. Berkeley Lab estimates US data centers used 176 terawatt hours in 2023, about 4.4% of US electricity. And they project 325 to 580 terawatt hours by 2028, depending on scenarios. Cooling stops being a facility detail and becomes part of national energy planning. A third reason is industry momentum. When major infrastructure companies start buying liquid cooling companies, it signals mainstream adoption. For example, Trainee Technologies announced an agreement to acquire LiquidStack in February 2026 to scale advanced liquid cooling for high-density workloads. Let's talk real deployments and pilots without turning this into a logo parade. Microsoft has publicly discussed running two-phase immersion cooling in a production environment. Telefonica has publicly described deploying an immersion cooling solution at its Belas Vistas central office in Madrid. A UK data center company, Stellium, has publicly discussed deploying immersion cooling at a data center campus project. Marathon Digital has discussed shifting operations toward immersion containers at its Granbury site. And Reuters reported Sustainable Metal Cloud uses immersion cooling and claimed major energy reductions. So yes, immersion is being used in the real world, in AI, telecom, colocation, and Bitcoin mining. Now, cost savings without a math lecture. If your facility spends a big chunk of electricity on everything that isn't computing, then improving cooling efficiency can translate to real money. That includes fans, air handlers, compressors, and dehumidifying. Here's a rough example. If your monthly electricity bill is $100,000 and 20% of that is cooling-related overhead, that's $20,000 per month. If a cooling upgrade cuts that cooling overhead in half, that's $10,000 per month saved. Not magic, just fewer watts wasted moving air around. Now, real projects have real costs. You're paying for tanks, pumps, heat exchangers, facility plumbing, service training, and sometimes immersion-ready server configurations. So the right question isn't, does immersion save money? It's, does it save money in your building? With your racks, your electricity prices, and your uptime requirements? To keep this honest, immersion cooling has trade-offs. You're introducing liquid into operations, which changes maintenance habits. Not all hardware is ready out of the box, and some deployments use immersion-validated servers. The fluid choice matters, including compatibility, safety, supply, and environmental profile. And immersion is not one size fits all. Some sites will choose direct-to-chip liquid cooling or hybrid designs. Uptime survey data shows operators worry about barriers. They worry about upfront costs, reliability concerns, maintenance complexity, and coolant leaks. So even people inside the industry are cautious and pragmatic. If you're evaluating immersion cooling, here's a practical checklist. First, are you hitting thermal limits with air or planning to within the next hardware cycle? Second, what is your real constraint? Power, space, water, or noise? Immersion can help with all four, but your bottleneck determines the payoff. Third, can you reuse heat? If you have a nearby use for warm water, immersion gets more attractive. Fourth, what is your fluid strategy? Ask what fluid you will use, what the environmental profile is, what long-term availability looks like, and what the service procedures are. Fifth, start small if you need to. You don't have to dunk the whole building tomorrow. Many deployments begin with a pod, a row, or a dedicated high-density cluster. Immersion cooling is one of those ideas that looks ridiculous until you understand the physics and the economics. With AI growth, grid limits, water stress, and hotter hardware, it's moving from weird experiment to serious infrastructure. If this helped, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what would stop you from switching? Is it cost, fear of liquid, or just not needing it yet?